Lucifarian energy is one of the most prevalent forces within the world at large, and especially within the spiritual community. And yet it is still one of the most misunderstood forces within nature. So today I'm going to be explaining from the esoteric sphere exactly what Lucifarian energy is. Lucifarian energy comes from the personified force in nature that we know as Lucifer. Now, Lucifer is an impulse within the cosmos and within nature. And this impulse has certain attributes and characteristics that set this force in nature apart from another force in nature and yet another force in nature. So it's distinct attributes and characteristics that this force in nature encompasses and embodies. And when it's expressed through that thought form, through those patterns, and through those elementals, then that is what composes a force in nature. And so Lucifarian energy is known for having a lot of exalted attributes and positive ones, and also a lot of what we would consider detrimental, negative, and even juvenile impulses and attributes within this force in nature. So it's really important to be able to look at this from the esoteric sphere of reality, because in the esoteric sphere, now we're able to look at things from a mature perspective and a more neutral or objective perception, rather than looking at something from the exoteric sphere, where we're more likely to confuse the true meaning of this force in nature and then assign it the same attributes as other forces in nature that are similar, but ultimately are not at all the same force in nature. So Lucifarian energy, when we're looking at it from the esoteric sphere, is composed of primarily two elements. And those elements are fire and air. In my video, Spiritual Alchemy, the Esoteric Art of Ascension, I talk about how all of the cosmos is created by different ratios of the elements, as well as body, spirit, and soul. Lucifarian energy only contains within it fire and air, an overemphasis of spirit with very little soul and no body. This impulse, this stream of consciousness that is a personified force in nature, seeks to expand human consciousness. And so for that reason, it is very positive and beneficial for a being to have Lucifarian energy harnessed when they need to expand their consciousness. That's why Lucifarian energy is also equated with enlightenment. Because if we had to give Lucifarian energy any credit for anything, it would be enlightenment. It's a very enlightening and insightful energy when we're harnessing it in that spiritual purpose. So Lucifarian energy has a certain degree of enlightenment with it, but we can still look at it as like a juvenile form at the end of the day of this enlightenment, because it's one that's not embodied. And it's one that is missing key information due to the fact that its perception is coming strictly from the elements of fire and air. So it's not an embodied state at all. In fact, Lucifarian energy seeks to disembody the human consciousness. It actually thinks there's a problem with the material realm. It has an issue with physicality. It constantly thinks that humans and human consciousness needs to be saved from the physical experience. And that's where we have seen all of our spiritual teachings up into this age come from. One form or another has been heavily influenced in the spiritual community, in religion, in all forms of belief systems. Lucifarian belief systems have been the stronghold. They have been the dominant energy of any form of spiritual beliefs here. And even the funny thing is that when people think they're coming from Christ consciousness, so much of the time they're actually coming from Lucifarian energy. This is when a being is overly subjective, like super subjective, lifted out of their body into such a high state of spiritual realization, of such a high state of expanded, insightful consciousness that they start having no discernment whatsoever. And they start to believe that this ecstatic peak state of consciousness that they're in, this heightened ecstasy, is the true form of reality. And anything else they begin to deny. So they deny humanity from divinity. And then they put a very one-dimensional form onto divinity. And so this is what's coming from the elements of consciousness that are perceiving the human experience as being wrong, as being soiled, literally. And because it's coming from an exalted viewpoint, but one that is lacking all of the different degrees, all of the different multidimensional elements in order for it to fully be integrated into something that we would consider now in this age as Christ consciousness. So it's a consciousness that is pre-discernment. Discernment can be linked with what we know as Christ consciousness. It's more integrated. And so without discernment, what we're left with is an undiscerning form, which is therefore juvenile in nature, because to not have discernment is to be immature. In fact, a lot of these concepts about Lucifarian or Harmonic or even satanic energies can be looked at by someone as being like, oh, this is just religion remixed. This is just, like a religious tone placed onto spirituality. But really, the most mature way of distinguishing religion from spirituality is looking at religious concepts as being a very diluted, very contorted, and distorted form of what the true spiritual essence that's contained within these concepts are. So spirituality is more of the mature, developed observation and knowing of these forces in nature. So these different personified forces in nature are going to be influencing and impacting human consciousness, regardless of whether we know about them and regardless of whether we view them as only being from religious belief systems. It's more so that these religious belief systems didn't understand them in a mature fashion. They didn't understand how these forces truly act upon our human consciousness and what that relationship with these forces in nature are. So the strongest way that Lucifarian forces influence human consciousness is by getting it to escape the human experience. Lucifarian energy likes to break things out of their structure, which is a very positive force to harness if one is looking to break out of certain belief systems that no longer serve them, is looking to expand their consciousness. But what this energy seeks to do is fully break a being out of the physical experience, out of their human consciousness, to the point where it's actually detrimental. This is where escapism, this is where addiction, this is where denial come into play. Lucifarian energy is the strongest force behind addiction. It's the strongest force behind any type of spiritual escapism from the physical reality or any type of escapism in general. And it's definitely behind any type of energy that seeks to deny humanity, to deny emotions, to deny anything that is a part of the human and mainly a part of the physical experience. So it's one that is the prominent feature within the false light. If you'd like to know more about what the false light is, you can watch my video on the false light deception, because in that video, I basically talk all about Lucifarian energy without saying that term yet and without introducing it, as well as its opposing force in nature, or its counterbalancing force in nature, which is harmonic energy, which is the personified force in nature that we know as calcification or inertia. So Lucifarian energy is a part of that false light dichotomy because it is opposed to body. It is opposed to physicality and to matter. And it's trying to save human consciousness by helping it escape the physical realm. Anytime a being is overly, enthusiastically in a frenzy-like state for their belief systems of a religious nature, that is Lucifarian energy. And any time a being is in such an expanded, ungrounded state of consciousness that they're in a state of oneness, but a juvenile phase, a juvenile state of oneness, that is Lucifarian energy. And that is so prevalent, especially in the spiritual community, among people who mean well, but they are coming from a very undiscerning viewpoint. And what I mean by an undiscerning viewpoint is when we think we're in an exalted state of consciousness for not being able to have discernment, or to not be able to discriminate between higher and lower, or discriminate between different concepts. Lucifarian energy mainly expresses itself in the spiritual community as the phrase, everything is everything. You see how there's no discernment inside that phrase? That phrase can also mean something very beautiful and has an exalted and accurate truth to it. But when we're using it in the Lucifarian perception, and we're having the Lucifarian influences upon our consciousness, when we go everything is everything, we're actually coming from a very juvenile and immature perception. It's one that wants to actually shut down discernment, shut down maturity and spiritual growth. So we're abusing this higher truth of everything is everything by coming from a rebellious energy. Rebellious specifically against there being a process, a rebellious energy around there being a structure in place, or having to even learn a system, or even through the dynamic of there being teacher-student. Because somebody who's truly in an everything is everything state wouldn't even have an issue with there being a teacher and learning sometimes. That would be actually a more aligned, integrated, and egoistless state if we're going to talk about the ego in any form of negative or positive ways. In a positive way of being egoless, it would be having no issue with there being a teacher sometimes, and with there being a process of learning. This mentality of everything is everything, or my opinion is equal to your opinion and matters just as much as your opinion, even though I am not informed and I am ignorant, comes from the shadow side of oneness. It comes from the side of oneness that does not recognize differentiation is included within the all. So within discernment, which is the holy, sanctified state of oneness, you're able to hold the truth that we are all one, and also hold the truth that there are various different grades of truth. There are various different grades of awareness. So division and unity coexist within oneness, which is why a lot of people are innocently confused in the spiritual community around what unity timelines are and divided timelines, thinking that they're coming from a truly integrated state of consciousness when they say all beings are going to ascend. There's only one, when in reality, they can't perceive beyond that Luciferic thought form to see inherently that in unity consciousness and in discernment, there are going to be differentiation. There are going to be, through the act of having free will, different choices play out for different individuals, which call forward different timelines, even if that means timelines split. So it's common to think that there's only one ascension trajectory for all, not knowing that that's just Lucifarian energy that hates free will. In fact, the second most prominent feature within the spiritual community and within the world at large, which is an impulse and a stream of consciousness coming from Lucifarian energy, is the fact that free will is wrong, or that free will doesn't even exist, because it denies other aspects and attributes within creation. It cannot see free will, and yet the dissonance and the paradox of the Lucifarian energy is that it is constantly trying to save humans from their own free will. So it has major issue with there being free will, and yet the dissonance, the fragmentation going on in this energy is that it denies free will and yet is severely always trying to save humans from their own free will so that they go back into an earlier stage of development and do not continue to mature. It sees something inherently wrong with the process of development and the process of evolution. And so it wants to save us, like we're children, from having free will, and it wants to diminish all of our senses so that we thoroughly disintegrate only into the senses of observing and hearing, so that we're just eyes and ears. And that state of passivity is what the Lucifarian energy views as exalted, and it truly views as enlightened and what is correct for humanity. So it's trying to save us from making free will decisions. It is strongly opposed to free will and truly believes that we need to be in the peaceful state of observation and hearing only. No other senses, no other course of evolution throughout any more of our bodies, like the physical body, the mental body, the emotional body, and the etheric body, and our astral body. It wants us to go back to an earlier time of our evolutionary course so that it's in an immature and juvenile form of what consciousness is. And that's where we see all of the spiritual systems from the past have threads and very strong connections with. Any time that our humanity was pitted against our divinity, or that there was a heightened state of encouragement towards the spiritual at the expense of our human nature or at the emotional body or any of those. And believe it or not, even though our human consciousness is transitioning into another phase of consciousness right now, meaning that Lucifarian energy is not going to be the dominant influence upon humanity, even though it was in the past. There's still a heavy influence of Lucifarian energy within the spiritual community. Anytime humans need to look at the world in an overly subjective way that has severe cognitive dissonance in how it views spiritual teachers, spiritual concepts, spiritual beliefs, so that it needs to be fragmented from any form of humanity. And when we view that as needing to go back to a very infantile form of development, that is what the New Age community and the spiritual community and the consciousness community at large, all these different parts of the spiritual community, are waking up out of and are integrating. They're learning now that this Lucifarian energy, even if they're not calling it Lucifarian, is not all there is to the story. And that even though it's super helpful to have the understanding from these forces in nature and have what their gifts and knowledge bring to the table, that there's more to this story and there's more to becoming multidimensional and even embodying our higher self. So anytime we're stuck in super fundamentalist religious concepts or super fundamentalist concepts in general that have to do with spirituality or the way that we view the world in a very juvenile and one-dimensional form of existence, it is coming from this personified force in nature. Or, if that's too pagan for you, it is coming from this thought form within consciousness. And this thought form is one that has enormous amounts of cognitive dissonance in it. So we see in the world at large, the biggest issue is cognitive dissonance. And this dissonance, it meaning compartmentalization. So this compartmentalization that creates so many forms of fragmentation all comes from it not being a cohesive and unified consciousness, which is why Christ consciousness is also known as unity consciousness, because it's a unified form of consciousness. So Lucifarian energy is fragmented, and that's why you can tell when a being has heavy amounts of cognitive dissonance that that's just Lucifarian energy. This could even be placed in a hyper-spiritual tone, kind of like everything's from the heart. Now, I've made several videos about how important heart-centered consciousness is. But when Lucifarian energy takes hold of this concept of the heart center and heart-centered consciousness, it does one where it needs itself and the beings that it's influencing the human consciousness within to be in denial of the mind, to be in denial of its emotional body, to be in denial of everything, because once again, Lucifarian energy is one-dimensional, and it needs you to only be eyes and ears, meaning it truly feels like it's in the peak state of existence by being as passive as possible, as non-action oriented as possible, and as peaceful as possible. But in this way, it isn't true peace because it's not coming from true fulfillment and disidentification. It's just coming from denial and fragmentation. So it even appears sometimes as truly heart-centered, and it can come through that facet and that stream of belief systems, but it's one that's always creating fruits, meaning you're always going to get as the end product of that some sort of judgment or some sort of denial and resentment of self. So that's how you know when a being is heavily inside Lucifarian energy. It's where they're coming from that oneness, that truth of the heart center. But they're coming from that highlighting all of the parts within heart-centered consciousness and within oneness that diminish and that make you judge and turn against the emotional body, the mental body, the etheric body, all of the other bodies within our energy field. That's also why its favorite game to play is light versus the dark, or God against the devil. So all of those different belief systems, because you can have that story play out in so many different flavors within this age. It doesn't need to be strictly just one type of religious belief system anymore, but we could still pull from this religious thought form, that's Lucifarian, of light versus dark, and of God versus the devil, and all the different ways that that story plays out is coming from Lucifarian energy, because it's coming from that fragmentation and that dissonance within that being. So this doesn't mean that there's no such thing as light and dark, but when we're viewing it through a very fundamentalist mentality, very elementary in our stage of consciousness, and not coming from a more mature and integrated form of consciousness, this is Lucifarian energy trying to fragment our consciousness into a more immature state, which is why the Latin word for religion is regard, which is to withhold, to tie back. It wants you to do over. It wants you to do that evolutionary cycle again. It does not want you to move forward. It does not want you to move past the threshold of free will being an illusion and into the threshold of Dharma, of discernment, of mature consciousness, of unified consciousness. In fact, if it wasn't for some key positive traits that this state of consciousness contains, I would be calling this personified force in nature dissonance or fanaticism. But Lucifarian energy would best be described as the personified force in nature of deviance. It is a rebellious energy. There's a lot of positivity to not liking structure, especially if that order that structure has created is one that is not actually order at all. You would need a lot of rebellious, a lot of deviant energy to harness so that you can be able to break out of those belief systems to clearly perceive the fact that that structure or that order was not actually in a healthy state of consciousness at all. And that's why Lucifarian energy in its most exalted form brings with it the deviance that a being needs in order to break out of whatever stagnation and whatever calcification their stream of consciousness is currently stuck within. So this deviant energy that Lucifarian energy brings is enormously beneficial for when a being is channeling, because when a being is channeling, they need a large bandwidth to really go anywhere meaningful and to have that multidimensional full range spectrum. And even though Lucifarian energy is not multidimensional and full bandwidth spectrum, it would be very positive to harness that energy in those times to be able to go into higher states of consciousness and the highest states of dimensions, having within that same bandwidth also the information to stay grounded and to stay embodied and integrated. So it can be a very useful team member within our bandwidth. And because of that, that's how we evolve. We evolve by using the positive attributes of this Lucifarian energy as a deviant, because all evolution comes from a state of deviance, deviating from the norm. Now, there's negative concepts within deviation that I don't even need to go over because we're already familiar with the detrimental side of deviance. But we rarely look at deviance in its positive and exalted light. And the Lucifarian energy is the best frequency or the best personified force in nature when it comes to this exalted form, this enlightened form of deviance. So long as a being is aware of the negative form of this same force of deviation, which in this case would be to rebel unnecessarily against what is. So it's one that denies through its rebellion. It's in its youth. It denies and rejects the larger concepts of knowledge and information that are coming into the stream to help develop that being and develop that consciousness. So when a being is using consciously the Lucifarian energy in its exalted form, it's no longer in control. It's no longer this force influencing us in a possessed way. We're using it now in a conscious and grounded demeanor. Lucifarian energy is known for being redeemable. This is depicted in the parable of the crucifixion, where one rebel, who is crucified next to Jesus, asks him to remember him. Jesus is the middle pillar, which is the personified force of the middle way. He assures the rebel that he will be with him. The title rebel was then later translated to thief. The illustration of the crucifixion being in a trinity is intentional and symbolic. It's to illustrate the three pillars of the tree of life. The esoteric significance of Lucifer is that the Lucifarian energy does not run through a column that can go as high as the middle column, otherwise known as Christ consciousness column. It cannot go to Keter, on the tree of life, but it can still be redeemed. It is not a direct adversary to our evolution, the way harmonic forces are. Lucifarian energy can be reasoned with, and it can come into balance. One could even say it could be saved. Ultimately, Lucifarian consciousness plays out like a Greek tragedy. It never truly attains its goal for getting humanity into a higher dimensional, multidimensional realm of existence, because it can only drag human consciousness by fragmenting it into the realms of the false light, where it resides, where it doesn't even know that it's not in the peak state of consciousness, but forever thinks it is in the peak state of consciousness. I hope this has saved you. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.